Hello and welcome to the debate. I'm Marcia Hashimi. Thanks so much for being with us. Well, France is deploying more troops to one of its former colonies, the Central African Republic, that happens to be filled with valuable stones and metals. Paris says that it must get involved due to the violence that is taking place in the country. However, many experts say it has more to do with the love of minerals than the love of human life. We'll take a look at what is exactly behind the violence in the Central African Republic and France's intervention in its former colony.
France has increased the number of its troops in the Central African Republic. 1,600 French troops are deployed in various parts of the country, including the capital Bangui. The additional deployment quickly started after the UN Security Council approved the intervention of French and regional African forces in CAR. This comes amid the outbreak of deadly violence in the African state in recent days. Clashes have taken place between Christian armed men and Muslim fighters who've ruled the country since the ouster of President Francois Bozize in March. The unrest has caused casualties and displaced many. France says its intervention is aimed at protecting civilians.
To respond to the chaos in the Central African Republic, the UN Security Council has adopted unanimously a resolution mandating an African force to bring security, re-establish stability, and protect the population of the country. France supports this operation and has no other motive than to save human lives.
Saving civilian lives and winning UN support just seemed to be a cover for boosting military presence in the Central African Republic. Earlier this year, Paris sent troops to another former African colony, Mali, with a stated goal of purging what French officials call terrorists and protecting civilians. However, on the ground, the French intervention just added to the problems of the already crisis-hit African country. It led to civilian death and displaced many more. France also intervened in the Ivory Coast conflict and participated in the NATO war on Libya in 2011. The conflict in Libya massively destroyed its infrastructure and killed many people. France says it wants to stop sectarian violence, prevent genocide, and save lives in its colonies. In 1994, however, France was accused of supporting a genocidal mass slaughter of 800,000 ethnic Tutsis by the Hutu regime in Rwanda. All these raise doubts whether France wants to help its former colonies, with some speculating that it's seeking a neo-colonial policy. The Central African Republic is rich in gold, diamonds, uranium, and other minerals. They've largely remained unexploited due to years of internal problems. The country is also believed to have petroleum deposits along its northern border with Chad. Private estimates speak of the presence of 2 billion barrels of oil.
I'd like to welcome my guest to the program out of London, African affairs expert, Mr. Ayo Johnson, and an African policy analyst out of Washington, Mr. Nii Akuetteh. Thank you both for being with us. Let's start this off now in Washington, actually, with Mr. Akuetteh. What role does France want to play in the Central African Republic in your perspective?
Well, thanks for having me on the program.
Thank you for being with us.
I think, particularly when you are dealing with governments and when you are dealing with European former colonial masters, and especially with France, you have to take everything they say with a large grain of salt. So you have to pay attention to what they are saying, but not necessarily believe it. You have to check it against the facts on the ground. So France has said that it wants to go in because the conflict there, the chaos is spreading, innocent people are being killed. Those two facts are right. But for me, one of the questions is, 9 months ago in March, when the Seleka rebels with Mr. Jotodia, the current president, was at the head and was coming into Bangui, that government requested the help of the French, and the French refused. So it raises a big question, why now? That makes me doubt their stated intentions. On the other hand, there are African troops there, and the Africans were in the United Nations Security Council, and they voted for it. So I guess My focus is, my position is, let's watch what they are doing. There may be legitimate reasons to help the chaos and the killing to stop, but we cannot just take France at its word.
What's your opinion, Mr. Johnson, on what our guest in Washington has just stated?
Yes, I to an extent I will support some of those views, but I think ultimately, like we've seen in Mali, the French seem to be taking the moral high ground lately. They are trying to change geopolitics to suit themselves and to align the West back into pushing China and Russia and the other stakeholders away as potential stakeholders of Africa's minerals. That is not in a doubt. And the question is, who will be prepared to help Africa right now? The African Union is the only body that has the capability collectively to support any military efforts to rid some of these ills that are happening in the Central African Republic. But sadly, they do not have the financial muscle. Sometimes they do not have the logistical input, and sometimes they do not have the numbers on the ground in terms of reactive force. And this is where the French, who have been able to put their hands up, accept that they're willing to help, have been able to take advantage of. I believe that there should be a caution, but a reality. The situation on the ground calls for help. The African Union has supported it. The rest of Africa, collectively, as we see them in France, have voted for it. The United Nations has endorsed it. I think it's elementary to even think otherwise, that the French should not go in. The question is, can we make sure that the French meet up to their word? They go in, they help out, and that's as far as it goes. But usually, as we know,
let me stop you right there,
let
me stop you right there. Have we seen that in the past, Mr. Johnson? Actually, the French actually keeping their word, and as you were saying, just going there and keeping the peace and security, and actually not dealing with the natural resources, especially when we're talking about one of their former colonies on the African continent in general.
Well, the final point that I was just about to say before you interjected, and I can only thank you for your comments there, is the fact that the usually winners of these conflicts, which invariably the French are hoping they are, usually it's their contractors that will eventually come and rebuild the country. It's their contractors that would eventually, and their multinationals that will mine the minerals, and they would also get the prize. So that's the offset for France, I believe, getting involved in this conflict. They know that ultimately they will get an unlimited supply of Africa's minerals at a very simple price.
All right. What about that, Mr. Johnson? I mean, Mr. Akuetteh, as our guest has said. Mr. Johnson has said the winners are usually the contractors. What about the people on the ground in these countries? When are the people actually the winners when these Western countries get involved?
Well, you know, that's a great question about what the people, the citizens of the Central African Republic in this case, how are they going to win? What will they get out of it? I think that, you know, this is why once there is sufficient security, we must focus on creating an inclusive democratic government so that the people will then elect those who govern them and then insist. Electing the government will not be enough. You have to insist that they do what you want them to do, which is to make sure that all the agreements signed for exploiting the wealth of the Central African Republic, those agreements meet certain standards: transparency, protection of the environment, and of course, paying decent price and having that money be used to improve the lives of the Central Africans themselves. Now, that has not happened. But I do also think that previously you asked a great question about France's past, its past record. There is no question, you know, Africa has had a very difficult colonial history, and one of the worst has been France. Its armies have depredated Africa, all over Africa, Central Africa and West Africa especially. And even since the colonial times, we know what they did in Rwanda and other places. However, the other thing to give Mr. Hollande a little credit is he seems to have a very different philosophy. than the previous French leaders. I mean, if I may use the example of the United States, Barack Obama is very different from George Bush. George Bush invaded Iraq and Afghanistan. Barack Obama is shutting down those two wars. And so in some ways, Francois Hollande, it may be different from his predecessors. I just think, so he may be turning a new leaf, but I'm not prepared to trust him. I just say we have to watch him. And I agree very much with what Ayo said. The situation on the ground calls for help. France said it is helping, it is doing with the UN mandate, and the Africans are there watching. Finally, we, the Africans, we have to push our Africa Union and our other governments to make sure that we have strong enough force. We have 54 countries, so when there is a problem, we don't have to go begging France and the United Nations. We need to clean up our acts very quickly.
Okay. Well, let me look at that, Mr. Johnson. Mr. Akuetteh, he compared, for example, Francois Hollande to Barack Obama and basically said Barack Obama is different from George W. Bush. But if we use that comparison, yes, he is trying to get out of Iraq and Afghanistan, but many people would say he has escalated in many wars in many areas, especially the drone strikes. So as far as how different they are, and can we expect really Francois Hollande to be any different than his predecessors?
I think they're all the same. I think the Western agenda is the same. It's the same whether it's the United States, whether it's Europeans, including the French. I believe their ultimate objective right now, collectively, is to dislodge China, to dislodge the BRIC nations, Brazil, India, Russia, and the rest. How do European companies get back into Africa? How do they maintain that control? How do you ensure that China doesn't continue getting and controlling the grip on Africa as it currently has? And these wars, these instabilities in Mali, in the Central African Republic, provide that opportunity, which they are prepared to do in terms of providing military capabilities, to be able to dislodge one group for another. In this particular instance, is to get rid of rebels. On other cases, is to install a government. But either way, by them being on the ground, by them taking the initiative, by them getting the endorsements, invariably they would control those countries through their wealth, which is their mineral capabilities. So ultimately, be it the French, be it the Americans, be it other Europeans, they are all singing from the same hymn sheets. And ultimately, it's to dislodge and change geopolitics, which has not been in their favor for a very long time.
Okay, well, viewers, stay with me. I want to cross over to our Facebook viewers and check it out, some of the comments that some of our viewers have sent on this subject.
As Africans, we support AU military action, not UN or Western imperialists who are always after our resources. Since African leaders are only generous in corruption and money laundering, France will be waging stronger in its hegemony to boost its economy, which is in distress. France is the official and unique culprit of all violence in many African countries. France has created divisions, differences, oppositions and rivalries everywhere in its former colonies. There are a lot of time bombs set up by France that are exploding one after the other in a predictable manner. We see a constant movement towards old-fashioned colonialism tactics to reap the resources of the world in one direction, west if possible. But there are competitors in this. West has more experience at rape and pillage of the world and has subdued some of the main possible competitors, however. Just noticed last week with my Pakistani friend in chat that I have excessive material goods to the point of being buried alive in them, and he has utterly nothing. What caused this imbalance and how will it affect the future of the world?
Well, what about that, Mr. Akuetteh? Would you say that this is not only to control the natural resources, but also to make sure that others, for example, as Mr. Johnson has said, such as China, that they do not get control over those same resources?
I think that is a great point. I think that's a great question, and I've been dying to weigh in on it, and I also listened carefully to what the people on Facebook said. Yes, I mean, I don't deny that Western countries have a very long, sordid record of raping and exploiting Africa, and it was not just during colonialism. We have to remember all the black peoples of the Western Hemisphere were Africans who were enslaved largely through the instrumentality of Europeans and settlers in the Western world. So I have no blinders on when it comes to Europe, what it has done to Africa. But I do think as an African, and I do think other African patriots, what we have to learn from that difficult 500 years of history is that we should trust no one. Yes, I think I'm suspicious of the French and I'm suspicious of the West, but I don't, on the other hand, China itself in Africa is also after African resources. So in the same way that I want to protect African resources for the benefit of Africans from the Europeans, I also want to keep an eye on the Chinese. I don't want to have blinders and say, okay, the Chinese must be angels. Secondly, the United Nations just voted unanimously for the troops going into the CAR. China is a member of the Security Council. It could have vetoed it, and it didn't. China also has just sent part of the international troops into Mali. So I agree with a lot of what is being said, but I am dismayed that some of us seem to think that the Chinese are angels and they are not out after our resources. I think Africans should say to everybody who wants African resources, fine, let's be transparent, no violence, you want our resources, you have to pay us a good price for it, but we should trust no one.
Okay. Well, what about that, Mr. Johnson? France, of course, is going into this saying that they need to be in there to restore security. If we go back to the 1990s, we look at 1994 and Rwanda and the way that the French actually supported the slaughter of the ethnic Tutsis by the Houthis. So what has happened? What has made this transition from Paris now basically being a lover of African human rights and security?
Well, the French can change their position at their will. The ultimate objective is to make sure that Africans are aware of that change when they see a French action in the 90s completely different from the one that we see today, or even vice versa. I see ultimately it comes down to choices. Africans and their leaders can choose. And in a way, they are choosing.
Let me just jump in here right here. Let me just jump in what you said. You said that African leaders can choose. Can they really choose? Will the French allow them to choose a direction, let's say, that does not go in favor of Paris? Would they allow a government actually to come into power after all of this allegedly security is established that actually is anti-French involvement there? Would they allow that government to stand?
Well, if we already had a government in Central African Republic that I could say thumbs up, came through the democratic process, I would have said yes, but we don't. What we do have are rebels who've taken over a country, who are controlling that country and hijacking it. So yes, to an extent, the French being there now can influence that change, that decision as to who wins that war. But ultimately, the French can also influence who eventually wins the ballot box, who eventually becomes president, who's endorsed by the West. Because usually, as we've seen in cases with elections gone by across Africa, if the endorsement is not given by the West in terms of being free and fair, the rest of the world somehow don't seem to accept that such elections can be free and fair, like in Zimbabwe. So yes, the influence will be felt now, as we're seeing with French troops on the ground. The influence will be felt that much more apparent during elections, which will have to follow for there to be democratic process. And the influence will be seen and felt when French and the Europeans will endorse whoever it is has won that election. We are hoping those individuals will follow rule of law and the democratic process. But yes, the influence would be seen throughout. And this is a change of the guards. This is a change of process. This is of the West getting back on equal terms, or at least trying to push those who are already there, the Chinas of this world. The Chinas of the world, they are there by default. The Africans chose them, as opposed to the West, who came in the 50s and 60s being imposed on Africa. And I think this is the relevance and the difference which my colleague was trying to make reference to, because it's the choice factor
But Mr. Akuetteh, tell me about the choice factor. At this point in time, what do the Africans have to do? We're talking about Central African Republic specifically now. Let's assume that security is reestablished. What do they have to do to make sure that they get the best deal for themselves and that they have more control of their own natural resources and the benefits from these resources?
Once again, I think that's a great question. And I know that you said Central Africa Republic, that one country. But I do think that because of Africa's history, but also because regional issues are important everywhere, the Central Africans cannot do it just by themselves. They need the help of their fellow Africans, the African Union. So my point, I mean, your question is great. The way that the Central Africans need to do after security is established is to begin the process of establishing a democratic system and a democratic government. And they will need the help of for instance, the African Union, the troops that are on the ground. After all, the Africans are from the 19th of this month, they are supposed to put in 3,600 troops, which are 3 times as many as the French. So those African troops have a role to play. The governments that are sending them there, as well as the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, also has to keep its eyes clear. The African members in the UN Security Council have to watch the mandate, so they must all watch what France is doing. I agree with Ayo, and I may have a slight difference of view on the role of the Chinese, but we agree that the Africans need to do their homework and keep an eye, because you cannot trust the French. Even during the establishment of a civilian government, we have to watch what they do, because they have troops and they can tilt the elections in any direction.
All right. Well, thank you both for being with us. We are actually out of time, but I appreciate both my guests, Mr. Ayo Johnson, African affairs expert out of London, and African policy analyst, Mr. Nii Akuetteh, out of Washington. And as always, viewers, we appreciate you being right here with us for another look at the debate. I'm Marcia Hashemi, signing for myself and all the crew right here in Tehran. Thanks so much, and goodbye.